Welcome everybody. We're going to get started with this session. My name is Harold Liversage and I work for IFAD as a land tenure advisor, and I've been asked to moderate the session. And this session we will be looking at the trends, the causes, the drivers and effects of land and natural resource access associated with agricultural and rural economies, focusing on inequitable access and what can be done to address this. We will also be looking at issues of gender inequality and the relationship with land rights access and what can be done about that, etc. I'm joined here by, at the moment we have two panelists here. We have Ricardo Fuentes, and I'll introduce him in more detail shortly, and Ilaria Bottigliero from IDLO. So sorry, Ricardo is from Oxfam, based in Mexico, and Ilaria from IDLO, currently based in the Netherlands, but HQ for IDLO is here. We'll be later joined online. We should have Violet Shivutse, who is the chair of the Huairou Commission. Unfortunately, she's based in Nairobi, and unfortunately right now they're having a fire drill. So she may or may not be online, but hopefully will join us shortly. And then the final panelist is Michael Taylor, who will be the director of the International Land Coalition, will be joining us shortly. Each of the panelists will be given 8 to 10 minutes to look at and consider the questions on what are the challenges and opportunities for improving access to land for poor rural communities, what should be considered in the formulation of appropriate development policies, strategies and programs for improving land access and its contribution to inclusive development and transformation and poverty eradication. And then finally, to consider the questions associated with how should such policies, strategies and programs be monitored and assessed in establishing whether they have the desired impact. So we will start with him, but before that, just to give I will kick off with a few introductory remarks. I think we widely recognize that improved or equitable access to land for poor rural people, especially for women, youth and more vulnerable groups, is central to poverty eradication, social inclusion. And it's reflected in the Sustainable Development Goal 1, as well as other development goals. It's also part of recognized in IFAD's policy on access to land and tenure security, in the voluntary guidelines and the governance of tenure, in the Africa Framework and Guidelines, and the ILC's 10 commitments. So it's widely recognized this is important. We also know that colonialism and pre-existing feudal type systems have had have resulted in large-scale land dispossession and highly skewed ownership in certain parts of the world, typically with substantial negative impacts. And also that population growth, urbanization, climate change, environmental degradation, globalization are all impacting often negatively on access to land for poor rural communities. At the same time, there's a substantial demand for dramatically increasing commercialized agriculture to meet the global demand for food and other commodities. And this drive for commercialization tends to result in increased average size of farms and also in people leaving farming and moving into other livelihoods and income-generating opportunities. This can either be a positive experience of wealth creation, increased employment and incomes, or it can be a negative experience of concentrated land ownership, landlessness, unemployment and poverty. So as I said, I think there's a general recognition that initially highly skewed ownership patterns has a negative impact. But while there are various papers arguing that economic growth tends to be high and more broadly shared when people have equitable access to land, the Gini coefficient on land ownership suggests perhaps there's some other factors that need to be considered. The highest inequality in land ownership is in South America, Central America, Caribbean, North Africa and Middle East. But there's some variation between those societies. It's also highly skewed in countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the US, as well as Western Europe, large parts of Western Europe. On the other hand, you have countries like in Southeast Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Western Central Africa, and East Asia, which have the most equitable ownership in land. And yet we see quite differences between those societies in terms of wealth and poverty. So this maybe raises one of the first questions that we wanted to look at, which is, on what basis does more equitable access to land contribute to more inclusive development and poverty eradication? And what other factors need to be in place? Related to this, there have been some that argue that smallholder farmers do not have the means to meet the growing global demand for food and agricultural commodities, and what we need are larger commercial farming units that can produce at scale. Others would argue that if properly supported, smallholder farmers can in fact feed the world and meet the growing demand for other agricultural commodities. And also that the smallholder farming sector will fundamentally contribute to broad-based wealth creation and social inclusion. And key to this, of course, are things like gender equality, inclusion of youth, etc. So maybe the next set of questions we want to consider is the various policies and programs that can contribute to a more equitable access to land, and how those can contribute to poverty eradication. And then finally, I think we need to look at issues of, beyond this, we need to look at how those policies, strategies and programs of improving access to land and poverty, how they contribute to poverty eradication. How are we going to monitor this and evaluate this, especially in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals? So those are that's broadly the framework that we want to frame the discussion. And without saying any more, I'd like to hand it over to the first speaker, Ricardo. Ricardo is the Executive Director of Oxfam in Mexico. Prior to that, he was the head of the research at Oxfam Great Britain, where he directed a high-profile investigation team to support the global campaigns and programs of Oxfam. Among others, he directed the research on economic inequality, which is widely referred to in both academic and political circles. Before joining Oxfam, Ricardo worked in the United Nations Development Programme, where he was the lead author of the African Human Development Report and co-authored various global reports. He has also worked in the World Bank, where he was a co-author on climate change and development for the World Development Report 2010. He's been part of the Ministry of Social Development in Mexico and worked for the Inter-American Development Bank. Ricardo has conducted research on topics of food security, climate change, social security and social policies, regional development, poverty and inequality. He graduated from the Center for Economic Research and Training in Mexico and received a master's degree from the University of Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona. So over to Ricardo for his thoughts.
Thank you. And thank you, IFAD, for the invitation to this very important conference. It's quite a responsibility to be in the first breakout session. And I think what I want to do in this 10 minutes that I have is actually tell kind of a story related to what Martin presented in terms of what's happening in global inequality and how that affects the lives of rural people, related to the rights to land, but also to other rights, and see how we can identify and design these new social policies that can enhance the rights of people, reduce the disparities that we see between rural and urban areas, but also the disparities we see within rural areas, and basically rethink what the role of the state in this new globalized, very unequal world is in relation to those people who are left behind. So, first, this is a graph coming from the World Inequality Report released in December, last December. So, and it's an update of a figure produced by economist Branko Milanovic, which tells the story of growth between 1980 and 2016, which is the period of globalization mostly. You know, what we see here is on the x-axis we see the world population divided by percentiles, so it's divided by 100 similar groups, and then we see on the y-axis the real income growth per adult, and so this graph, the original graph that Branko presented, and this graph, which is an actual kind of an updated graph, has been very widely quoted because it actually tells the history of the world in one graph over the past 35 years. And then what we see on the percentiles 10 to 40 is an increase in the incomes of the poorest people in the world. And that's the rise of emerging countries. And that's related to the poverty reduction in China that Martin was discussing, the poverty reduction in India that also has been happening over the past 35 years. And we see that happening, you know, so that's a positive story in a globalized world. But we also see, when you see the percentiles 50 to 99, we see that, you know, the growth there is much lower. You know, much lower, and that's the squeezing of the middle class in rich countries. And we've heard stories, given what's happening politically in countries like the UK with Brexit, and in the US with the election of Donald Trump, how the middle classes feel left behind. And this graph tells a similar story. And the story that we've been telling in Oxfam is the story that we see in the extreme right, and what we see that is the prosperity of the global 1%. You know, so over the past 35 years, we've seen the incomes of the poorest increase. We've seen relative, you know, you see it in absolute terms. Martin has already shown that it's a different picture. We've seen the relative incomes of the middle classes in rich countries fall behind, but what we see overall is the rise of a global elite that has captured relatively and absolutely the proceeds of a globalized world. And that's why we are all talking about inequality. That's why an organization like Oxfam started talking about inequality a few years ago. And that's why I think we need to start thinking about what it means in terms of the distribution of land and social policies around the rights of people in rural areas. So this is the setup. So this is what's happening. And then in words, what's the context? You know, I want to focus on a rights-based approach, not only a resources approach, but a rights-based approach. We've seen rapid urbanization around the world. We've seen the globalization process, integration of trade, the explosion of trade, very little migration, you know, so it's a globalized world, but with little migration. And what Danny Roderick has called the current trilemma of a globalized world. And this trilemma is the setup for my conversation. So what Roderick says is, in a globalized world, you can have either, so you have three points of a triangle. You have democracy, national sovereignty, and a global integration. And what Roderick says, you can have the three of them in a world like what we have. You can choose two of them. You can have a country with democracy and sovereignty, but then it won't be global integrated. Or you can have a country with global integration and democracy, but then it will give up sovereignty. Or you can have global integration and sovereignty, but then you won't have democracy. You know, this is a trilemma, and then some people like it, some people don't like it. I find it compelling. I find that it represents probably not the whole situation around the world, but it reflects what I think is happening in many cases, and then I'll explain why. Because I believe this is happening in many places, particularly in many places in Latin America. So, and then the question is, if we have a global integration, and then we have to choose between democracy and national sovereignty, then the question that I want to ask myself, and I want to ask the audience, is who then protects the rights of rural people, of poor rural people? And the examples are, imagine that we have a global corporation that goes into a small country and decides to invest in mining in that small country. And for that mine, there's a community, just next to that mine. So if this is globally integrated, then the state has a choice. They either promote the investment and protect the rights of the mining company that will be globally integrated and then will export the commodities around the world, or it protects the rights of the rural people. And then the question is, what's going to happen then? So if you're globally integrated and have the abiding obligation to open up to international corporations, then what's happening to the rights of communities? And you might think that this is a hypothetical issue, but we see it very often, happening in Latin America. We see that trade-off happening very often in cases where there's displacement of rural communities for the sake of mining. There's displacement of resources, land, but not only land and water, or reallocation of resources for extractive industries, with the idea of this investment will create resources through taxation, will create technology, will create employment. But what we see is none of that is happening. None of that is happening. And what we're basically seeing is a transfer of the importance of rights between a very powerful global actor, that's driving it's driving this inequality at the top 1%, for instance, and the people who are the voiceless and who all of a sudden are not represented anymore by the state. Some people might say, well, they were never represented, but now the balance of power changes even more, because now it's not only the local elites who are there to kind of try to take advantage of this despair power relation between the local elites and the rural areas. It's the relationship between the global elites who are investing very heavily, have the support of the local state, and then displace the communities. So that's the situation in which we're thinking. And then look, so Martin was also talking about the initial conditions. The initial conditions of land distribution in Latin America, for instance, is very unequal. This is from an Oxfam paper is using data from FAO and UNDP, FAO and UNDP. We know that land is very unequally distributed. And we also know that it's very hard to measure it. You look at the data; it's very outdated data, but it tells you some initial conditions of what's happening with land distribution in Latin America. You pair that initial condition of very unequal land distribution with a globalized process where you have a state that decides to move their power to protect the interest and the rights of global corporations, and then you have a disaster waiting to happen. And then the question is, and I think as Harold was mentioning, I think the question we need to ask is, how do we build social policies in this new world? How do we reclaim the necessity for the state to protect the rights of rural people, of poor rural people? How do we change the balance of power between the global corporations supported by states and the people who are isolated in some communities, and then we can identify a new social compact. The social compact that we have right now, social policies, conditional cash transfers, will not deal with this imbalance in power. We need to rethink how we want the state to relate with these communities, and how do we want the state to relate with these global corporations? At the end, it's an issue of the globalized dynamic. What has created is a system where if you're above the state, you're not accountable. Global corporations, usually global mining companies, for instance, are not accountable. They're located probably in Canada, but they have investments in all of Latin America. And then who do they respond to? They behave in one way when, they present their results in Canada. But they behave in a very different way because they're supported by the states when they're in Latin America. And then you see the consequences. You see the consequences in terms of violations of human rights, assassinations of right defenders of land. You see the marginalization of entire communities. And the question that we need to ask, if this is what's happening, how do we need the international financial institutions, for instance, but also organizations like Oxfam that are global networks, how do we need to change our approach to actually make this global investment accountable and make the national states accountable for the people who don't have a voice? And I think that's, I have 1 minute, so that gives me the time to conclude. I think that's the kind of question that we need to be asking ourselves right now. So the relationship with the state and citizen was already weakened before we see the rise of these enormous financial powers that are not accountable. When we see those investments happening, that relationship between the common citizen and the state is further weakened. And then what we see, we see it not only in middle-income countries like Mexico or in poor countries. We see it also in rich countries. And then what we see is kind of a weakening of the political systems and democracy. So it becomes a dynamic that is very dangerous, that we're seeing some of the initial results now. And if we don't want this ticking bomb to explode further, we need to start thinking seriously how we want the state to respond to the rights of the communities that are being left out. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. It's not working, but I'll just speak up a bit. Thank you for those words, and particularly highlighting the importance of the role of the state in fostering inclusive development, but also some of the challenges coming from globalization and the role of corporations, especially in mining and other extractive industries. Before we go on, I'd just like to welcome Michael. Unfortunately, he was a little late. We mentioned Michael Taylor from the International Land Coalition Secretariat is here now. He's joined us. And I wanted to check whether Violet is now online. She is online. So, Violet, there you are. We can see you on the screen. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Can you hear us? Violet, have you got the mute on?
Do you hear me?
We hear you now. Thank you.
Yeah, it's green. Yeah, it was red initially. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Violet, yes. In fact, now that we've got you online, perhaps I hope you've been able to follow Ricardo's presentation. If you are ready, perhaps we could ask you now to give us your thoughts on the topic, on what are the challenges, opportunities for addressing issues of access to land and its contribution to inclusive development. What should we be doing, and what does it mean for your work? But perhaps I should just introduce you a bit more in detail for the audience here. Violet, are you ready to present?
Yes, I do. I am.
Okay. So just to introduce you very quickly to the people here, Violet is the chair of the Huairou Commission's governing board. For the last 10 years, Violet Shivutse has worked as a community health worker and home-based caregiver in the Shibuya sub-region of the Shinyalo constituency, Kenya. She provides direct care and support to hundreds of HIV-positive community members, including orphans, elderly, and critically ill. Ms. Shivutse is the founder and coordinator of the Shibuya Community Health Workers and a regional watchdog group that works with local authorities to enforce land and inheritance rights of women and orphans. She works to build community resilience and combat climate change and negotiates with authorities for gender-responsive policies. She trains women and local authorities in local-to-local dialogues to ensure equitable implementation of development policies. Violet has represented the Huairou Commission in policy fora all over the world, and hopefully she'll be able to give us a bit more detail on what the Huairou Commission does, and continuously pushing for rural and grassroots women's inclusion at higher levels of dialogue. She is a grassroots representative on the UN Women's Global Civil Society Advisory Board. Okay, Violet, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. That is very kind of you with the introduction. And just to let the audience know that I'm a rural woman, and that's my background, and all those titles around caregiving is actually how I started engaging in the development world because of HIV/AIDS. And here I am as a farmer and also a leader from the local to the global. So that summarizes who I am. So I'll start with giving my presentation. Let's go to the second slide because the first one is just, yeah. So the background I have is that Huairou Commission is a movement of grassroots women-led organizations working in rural and poor urban communities. One of our strongest programs is Women and Land Rights. The program brings us together as grassroots women struggling with land rights, and from our struggles, we have learned to organize ourselves to identify solutions that respond to our land rights. So that's the genesis of our land rights program. The main purpose of this program is to enhance our capacity to have a collective voice, which is very important for us as rural women because we don't speak in silos. We like speaking, especially where land is really a political issue. When we speak in a collective voice, that gives us the power to influence decisions and also to prioritize our issues and to influence policy discussions around land rights. This helps us to set the agenda and work plans geared towards realizing our land rights and related agendas like food security and livelihood. The next slide. The next slide? Yeah, good. So I want to share about a case study from Africa, which is from an initiative called Women Land Link Africa that was started with Huairou Commission. And this case study begins in 1999. We all know how Africa was severely hit with HIV/AIDS, and the rural areas were the most affected areas. For us as rural women to respond to the alarming number of people who needed care at home, many of us got involved into caregiving through groups and alliances. Because if you remember, this is the period where we had big social adjustment programs that for the first time, like in my country, we were being asked to pay for health service. Initially, we used to walk to a health service when we are sick. And then HIV/AIDS came, which was something that really required regular nursing care and medical care. So part of what we did was to organize ourselves to provide this service in home, to respond to the lack of basic health services. As caregivers, we identified many widows who are being thrown out of home and their lands was snatched. So that's how we came into this scenario, because as caregivers, we go house to house, and we identified many of the women that we were caring for were being thrown out of homes. In 11 countries of Africa where this was reported, rural women members of Huairou Commission, we conducted mapping to ascertain the magnitude of land grabbing. Mapping is a basic way of collecting data and speaking to each other, speaking to the community, speaking to the leaders to really understand what is the situation of women land rights. So this is what we did as grassroots women. We don't call it research or survey. We actually call it mapping, because it's a basic way of collecting data. But it's an important aspect because then it helps us to generate information that can engage the community in a dialogue. So this mapping revealed gaps that were existing in access to land rights for the rural women. The next slide. The gaps included the patriarchy system that govern land, where we had land boards, we had the traditional systems, including the land offices themselves that were really men, And even how the land is being passed in our African context was from male to male members of the society. Women did not have awareness, neither communities, on the laws governing land. There was lack of implementation of laws, even where we had good laws. There was no implementation nor follow-up or monitoring to ensure the implementation. And also in areas like where we had the traditional land system, the land was not documented. So it was easy for a woman just to be thrown out if her husband dies, because her ties to this land was the husband or the male member of the society, like the father. So we used this to organize dialogues, to conduct advocacy, and more so to drive the land rights agendas as leaders. When we did this mapping, we kind of changed how we were addressing land rights as rural women. Not looking at land rights, our land rights, as a helpless constituency. We looked at it as leaders because we had helped the community to gather this information that was revealing the gaps that would change the dynamics around land. So we used this of the community to looking at us as change. We were actually looked as change agents, which actually transformed how the community was perceiving the rural women. I want to give you one of the photos. These are a group of rural women. And when I talk about the changing role or how community perceives women differently, these women are doing mapping around land rights, but particularly they are looking at the forest area that has been encroached. And with the issues of climate change and the rain patterns, how they are changing in the community, the women have led this. And if you'll see, this picture has very senior people from the government, like the district development officers. It also has the men who are like the warders, senior warders who are guarding the forest and the wildlife. And the women have engaged them to come to the side and see how land is being encroached and the consequences to the community. The next slide. I now want to talk about how rural women leadership is key in challenging inequalities in land rights. For example, Grassroots Women Resilience Program, which is one of the programs that as Huairou Commission, we derived from the women land rights. As rural women working in land rights, we have been able to design this program that demonstrates the relationship between women land rights, climate change, disaster in areas that have been struck with disaster, and poverty. And we are even now moving forward to looking at other aspects like where the countries are rebuilding after conflict. What is the situation of women land rights? How do these contribute to food security or insecurity at family level? Relationship to water, and all these resources that actually rely on land. And more than 30 community groups are participating in this community resilience program. The community resilience program specifically is looking at how communities can become resilient even in issues of disaster or during issues of climate change like heavy rains, the floods. The women can still continue generating food. Because for us as rural women, we have a task to bring food to our table. So it doesn't matter whether we have disaster, it doesn't matter whether we have drought or floods, we still have to bring food. So we designed this program to say grassroots women resilience, building community resilience, to ensure that grassroots women really positions themselves as key actors, as people who are angering to ensure resilience communities when these issues strike. We have conducted mapping in communities which lead to action planning through this forum like vulnerability risk mapping, where we are assessing the impact of things like forest encroachment. We are assessing the impact of what is happening after disaster in the community. How are women vulnerable? What is the context of vulnerability? What is the context of vulnerability where women have been denied land or have been evicted or thrown out by multinationals, things like that? And it's really actually helping us to set priorities and engage our governments in priority setting around these issues. When I talk about government for us, we are talking about local governments especially. Some are with national governments, but as rural women, we can access the local government more easily. And when we are not organized, when we don't have such facts and programs that help us to organize, we cannot access government as an individual. So the Community Resilience Program is facilitating us to become organized and be able to work to the local authority with information, with facts around the issues we care about on land and how they relate to the other issues as I had mentioned, which actually really positions us as leaders. With support from IFAD, it's a program I want to share. I'm not sure if I should share it here, but when the SDGs were launched, we had a campaign in Huairou Commission that we called, if these are the SDGs, then we are the goalkeepers. Then we said, if we are going to be the goalkeepers in SDGs, which did not happen in the MDGs, we were not aware of the MDGs, despite the big task that we were doing on safeguarding the rights of women in inheritance, on caregiving. No one recognized the role of rural women. So we don't actually know even if the measurements that was done to say how rural women performed in MDGs was real, because our contribution, we are not sure how it was counted. So this program, we worked with the Huairou Commission and the New York office and worked in 11 countries to have grassroots women to be at the center of achieving the sustainable development goals, educating their communities and the local leaders, the chiefs, on sustainable development goals, especially around land and agriculture, because that is where we belong as rural women. We care about SDG number 5A, 1 and 2, which is talking about the percentage of agriculture land accessed by rural women. We care about specific elements in the SDGs that we said we cannot sit and be beneficiaries in the SDGs. We have to come out and look at the indicators and really design them to inform what are the things that we want to see change in our community. We implement programs like the Global Land Tool, through GLTN. We have been on the forefront of implementing the tools that are being designed. We even sit with them to design the tools that can enable grassroots women to access their land rights. Tools that can be understood by grassroots women and be administered, if possible, by the grassroots women, like using the GPS to demarcate the traditional land systems, and many examples. You can see a big example there that I cannot finish the examples. So, I am showing you the other picture, which I did not put. This is a picture of a rural woman who is a trainer on tissue culture banana. She has identified a group of rural women farmers whom we have organized, and she's helping them to understand how to do the tissue culture banana. At this stage, they are doing the whole, putting organic fertilizer, which she's holding on the spade, to show how they count the organic manure in the hole to be able to plant the tissue culture banana. On the other side, you can see a picture of a rural woman who has done seeds, a nursery for trees, because we are also promoting agroforestry, because as rural women, we don't cook with gas. We cook with firewood, but then we are also learning how can we do agroforestry as women, change the dynamics in our community where women were not allowed to plant land, and also do energy fuel saving stoves, because now that we are growing trees, we understand the importance of trees, and we know the importance of conserving trees and using trees in a more sustainable way than just throwing in fire. And then we have a picture here that speaks to me a lot. I don't know if it speaks to everyone. This one on developing a community action plan. As rural women, what we have been doing is, with the information that we have, we sit with our communities. We know local authorities, most of them are not actually really funded. When we are working in organized group, we are likely, like Huairou Commission could fundraise small money to conduct mapping in countries where the rural women are ready around a given program. So we use this to come out with community action plans, which can then inform the budgets of the county. On the other side, you will see why I'm saying rural women are important. This is a feeding program that has been begun by the rural women to ensure that a school that has a high level number of orphans, the children are eating in the school. And this water, the tank here, was put by USAID, which was working with the rural women on HIV. They came to work on HIV and not on a food or feeding program. But the rural women identified this as an important aspect, and they started a feeding program. So they were given this tank by USAID. Okay, the next slide is just a comparison of the reality and the myths when people talk about rural women. I don't even have to read. You will see like which is describing the vulnerability, wherever. Those are the myths and the realities of what rural women are doing. Rural women are feeding the world. Rural women are designing programs based on the needs and priorities of the community, so they are not blueprint programs. Rural women are organized in alliances, so they are not hard to reach. You can actually reach rural women, but most development partners have never cared to reach rural women or invest in organizing rural women. Rural women are articulate on issues and have clear priorities on policies. 10 is the solutions to addressing inequalities. These are some of the solutions that I thought I would share with you. The first one is, it's important to recognize the contribution of rural women. That's where the genesis should begin. Because unless you recognize our contribution, then we can never be on the same table. We can never be equal partners. We can never discuss in the same way. But the moment you recognize us as important contributors and identify the areas where we are contributing, then it's easy for you to bring us to the table as partners. For anyone, I'm not speaking to the audience alone, but for even governments. The other one is
Violet, if you can start wrapping up.
Sorry, okay. So the other one, you can just, maybe I will just read through. Training should not just focus on capacity building for rural women. We also need training for governments and partners. We need meaningful partnership. And the context of land and agriculture is in the ongoing reforms is very important to us, and we need actually to be supported to participate in this. And investing in organizing is key. The SDGs, which I mentioned, of leaving no one behind, is an important area for us to include the rural women. So in moving forward, I'm not going to discuss. These are the things that we are thinking as Huairou Commission will be very important for us in moving forward with the rural women and land agenda. And we have Mino in the room there. Mino, I can't see you, unfortunately. You can all see me, but I can't see you. Who can respond to questions or will keep engaging in this conversation. She's the leader of the Women Land Rights Campaign globally in Huairou. And then my last picture is an appreciation for you in Swahili. Asante sana, Wamama Juu, Women High. Wamama Juu is Women High in Swahili. Thank you. That's a picture of one community-based organization where I'm a founder and a leader.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Violet. And
thank you.
Particularly for highlighting the importance of a bottom-up, of course, involving women taking power, but linking that work that's being done at the local level, influencing local decision-making, and then bringing that into a global campaigns and a network. I think that's very important. I think for IFAD in particular, in terms of the issue of land grabbing, the issue of land grabbing at a community level, and especially in terms of women, widows, etc., is one of the big challenges that we do face in our work. So thank you very much for that. If we can move on to the next speaker, Ilaria. Ilaria is the Director of Research and Learning for the International Development Law Organization. Her responsibilities include oversight of research, evaluation, impact assessment, as well as gender issues. Prior to joining IDLO, Dr. Bottigliero was lecturer and researcher at the Raoul Wallenberg Institution of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Lund, Sweden, and at the Lund University Faculty of Law. Dr. Bottigliero was also a lecturer at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and at the University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law. teaching a variety of international law and gender courses to graduate students. Dr. Bottigliero has lectured extensively in Europe and Asia on various human rights and international criminal justice topics. She is the author of Redress for Victims of Crimes under International Law, as well as several scholarly publications on victims' rights, international criminal justice, and gender issues. Ilaria, I'm going to say Ilaria, is a Hague counselor for the Hague Project for Peace and Justice and the recipient of the 2010 Worldwide Universities Network International and Comparative Criminal Justice Network Fellowship. Ilaria, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether this microphone works. I'll use the other one. Yeah, okay. Okay, that's better? Yes, good. Thank you for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks to the speakers for the very enlightening words. Ricardo, Violet, it's a pleasure to be speaking after you. I'm very happy to be part of this discussion today, representing the International Development Law Organization. We are an international organization focusing exclusively on the rule of law. So what I will do today is focus a little bit on the so-called rule of law approach to equality, with a particular focus on women and land. At the heart of our approach is inclusion. The notion that everyone is equal before the eyes of the law, and everyone is entitled to enjoy their human rights. We are fully committed to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development vision, that no one is left behind. And yet we see and we believe that rural women and girls are often the furthest behind, and hence the realization of their rights should be a priority for all of us. So on the one hand, we know that no one should be left behind. On the other hand, we do see people who are left behind, and women and girls are a clear example. IDLO is an organization with roots on the ground. Many of our beneficiaries are actually rural women. So we listen to them and we learn from their voices, their struggles, their demands, their needs. And many of these voices actually tell us that the rule of law is an essential enabler in the achievement of rural women's rights. So why is it important to ensure that whenever we have development programs having to do with land, with food, or more broadly with gender equality, we take into account the rule of law perspective, the laws, the regulations, the policies that are behind? Now, although women make up a large proportion of the world agricultural labor force, they have consistently less access to land, control over land, and productive resources. The State of the Food and Agriculture report has already emphasized that if women had the same access to land and resources as men, the overall food production could increase up to 30%. So that would be enough to feed 150 million of the estimated 118 million people who are suffering from hunger in the world. So in our own research, we have produced a report on women, food, land, which is called Exploring the Rule of Law Linkages Between the Three. And there are some interesting findings that I would like to summarize here with you. So looking at the relationship between gender equality, food security, and land rights, we have laid out a roadmap to use the rule of law to overcome discrimination against women, and especially rural women. Now, in the report, we identify three key challenges for women to claim their rights to land and food. The first key challenge that I would like to highlight today is persisting discriminatory laws and policies. Now, laws including land and property laws, as well as legal frameworks on dispute resolution and personal status, continue to either constrain directly or indirectly rural women's rights to land and food. We have at the moment 30 countries that still have laws that place men as head of households. 19 that legally require wives to obey their husbands, and 100 countries have legal restrictions on what types of jobs women can do. We have an alarming 102 countries that still deny women the same rights to access land as men. So the presence of discriminatory laws is a huge obstacle to the empowerment of rural women. Another problem is that often these laws and policies that affect women's lives are drafted without their participation. And rural women are particularly disenfranchised as they have less access to decision-making than either rural men or urban women. So not only these laws are discriminatory, but many times they are discriminatory also because they do not foresee the presence of women at the decision-making level. So when these laws are enacted or drafted or even conceived and discussed, the women are simply not there. And rural women far less than other women, for example, urban women. Now, aside from the challenge of discriminatory laws and policies, we have a number of implementation obstacles that I would like to signal, including the failure to consider the gender dimensions of existing laws, policies and processes relating to agriculture, trade, land, or the family, and their interactions with each other. For example, regulations on sale or transfer of land, which are not linked to gender-sensitive family laws, may enable one spouse to sell marital property, including access to communal lands and resources, and Violet mentioned it as well, without the others, generally the wife's consent. Another example, land rights are often implemented through titling and registration programs governed by legislation requiring that national cards, marriage or birth certificate, as well as deeds from a land registry office and courts be provided before titles to land are given. But we also know that these processes are often inaccessible to rural women, that many rural women simply do not have identity cards as other sectors of the populations. And they also have limited capacity to engage with administrative bodies. Fewer funds for registration fees, less access to social networks, and limited access to information. Now, this is, of course, a generalization, but this is what research shows predominantly in the sector of rural women. Now, I also wanted to highlight a final challenge having to do with some tensions that may be there arising from interactions between the formal and the informal legal systems. Customary land tenure systems in many regions are founded upon patrilineal patterns of transmission that actually exclude women and girls from owning or accessing individual and clan lands. Indigenous and peasant women can find themselves without access to collectively held forests, pastures, and other traditional food and non-food resources that are essential to their livelihoods. Hence, the failure to measure and address the gendered impacts of different normative systems may result in unequal outcomes for women. Now, having pictures and highlighted this very broad context and a few challenges, the question is, what could be the path to gender equality and justice for rural women within the context of land rights and food security? So having seen the obstacles, how do we move from there? This is a very practical question that as a field-based international organization we need to tackle every day, because we work with rural women, we work with rural people, so our aim is really to solve problems at the practical level. Now, there are 3 or 4 points that I would like to quickly make. First is to ensure the centrality of rural women's participation in the development, adoption, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of any law policy or programs related to land, natural resources, and food. This may seem like a very simple point, but it is essential actually to ensure enable equal decision-making roles in land and natural resource governance institutions. It's extremely important to engage diverse groups of women, which can help identify their priorities and their needs, as well as assess the impact of existing legal and policy frameworks on their rights. Now, the second element or path to success that I wanted to highlight is a focus on legal empowerment. The participation of rural women can only be fully realized if the women themselves are legally empowered to do so. Legal empowerment approaches, including legal education, legal aid services, rights awareness, the training of paralegals, can enable women to understand their rights. It's essential that women understand their rights, they know how to claim them, and that a more supportive and transformative environment is built to make change happen. So one cannot go without the other. I also wanted to highlight the importance of collecting and analyzing gender-relevant data and to learn from it. Now, many of the implementation challenges that I have signaled above can be addressed, among others, by having a gender impact assessment for every program and a gender impact assessment informing every stage of law or policy development and implementation. Now, these assessments should occur at the conceptualization stage as well as at regular intervals during implementation. So to have a gender analysis is actually quite simple step in program development, but is also essential to see what will be the impact and what will be the results for rural women in this case, but for gender equality more broadly in terms of program implementation. So it's very important to have gender analysis. It is also important to ensure that the lived experiences of the diverse range of stakeholders, rural women included, are taken into account. And although supporting the development of national level statistical and disaggregated data collection should be a priority, it is also essential to learn from community dialogues and other means that amplify rural women's voices. So the learning aspect of our work is very important. And then fourth, I just wanted to mention that the interplay between formal and informal systems is essential in choosing what are the best approaches to secure women's land rights in community where legal pluralism exists or where the reach of formal law and systems are weak. So many times in the development sector, we hear of approaches that actually exclude the informal systems. But if we're looking at results and how to engage women, we simply cannot exclude working and engaging with informal systems. We need to take what's best out of the both formal and informal systems and look at the optimal results for women to make sure that we keep our work on target and the focus on women themselves. A lot needs to be done. The question of resources hasn't been really tackled yet. More resource investment is needed, not just in terms of money, but also in political will and learning that political will and focusing on what works for rural women to enhance enjoyment of their rights. And unfortunately, at the current stage, efforts and allocation of resources on gender equality are actually falling behind the level to achieve the expected progress. So I'm going to conclude now. There is a lot to do, but we're all together in it, and I look forward to the discussion to tackle some of the issues that have been raised today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ilaria. I think especially for highlighting the interplay or relationship between formal and informal, how they can reinforce each other either positively or negatively. And then I think in terms of the importance of a legal framework, but also then the enforcement of that, awareness raising and legal aid, really important. It's not just enough to have a law, recognition in the law, but you actually have to be able to enforce it. So all of these dimensions, and I think quite a lot of what you said complements well, especially what Violet was saying. I think there was some good linkage there. Okay, the final presenter will be Mike Taylor. He's the director of the International Land Coalition Secretariat, located here, hosted by IFAD in Rome. He is a citizen of Botswana and has a PhD in social anthropology. The International Land Coalition is a global alliance of 265 multilateral and civil society organizations based in 77 countries, working together for land governance that is people-centered, equitable, and just. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Harold. Is the microphone working? Yes. Well, firstly, thank you to IFAD for organizing this. I think this topic is one that in many ways affects all of us in the work that we do. Certainly, as I think about the kind of world that my children and my children's children will inherit, apart from the environmental chaos we're wreaking through climate change, inequality is the other biggest issue that occupies me. The thinking, what if we consider the current trends, what is it going to be like in 30 years or 50 years, and what does that mean for the kind of societies, inequalities within societies, inequalities between societies? What does that mean for the world that we're going to leave to our children? And so it's big challenges, big questions, and so thank you again for IFAD to give us the opportunity to think through a little bit what it means for us. Now, obviously, because I work for the International Land Coalition, we, as many different kinds of organizations that are part of our coalition, think about the issue of inequality through the lens of land rights. The discussion on inequality has been very much at the forefront of a lot of development narratives over the last few years. The work of Thomas Piketty was mentioned, and I think a very big credit goes to Oxfam, different Oxfams around the world, who started putting out data into the public realm in the last few years of where are we actually at on inequality. And this figure, this is not an Oxfam cartoon, this was somebody that took the magazine called Politico that took the Oxfam data and was asking the question, what kind of world is it when 1% of people control nearly half of the world's wealth? What are the implications for that? And I think the implications are bound up in what we've heard quite a lot already over this morning, that concentration of wealth is really concentration of power, concentration of decision making in the hands of people with a very particular set of interests if they control that much wealth. Now, we've been asking ourselves in the Secretariat of the International Land Coalition and many of our members, how would these figures translate with regard to access to land, water, forests, and other natural resources? A, in terms of figures, and B, in terms of what then are the implications of that. What does that mean? And again, I come back to Oxfam, because Oxfam is one of the few organizations that has tried to ask these questions in a number of countries. We saw the data from Ricardo in Latin America, Oxfam Uganda, and a few other Oxfams are doing that as well. And it's quite interesting. So what we saw there from Latin America, correct me if I'm wrong, Ricardo, but the Gini coefficient for land in Latin America is higher than for income inequality. So what we see as extreme inequality in income is even more magnified when it comes to land. So 1% of farms in Latin America control more land than everybody else. That means 1% of farms in Latin America control more productive land than the 99%. That's an astounding figure. When you go to countries like Peru, 1% of farms control 77% of productive land. What the implications are for that in terms of society, because when we talk about land, we're not just talking about agricultural production. Of course, that's the main part of it. But what kind of societies exist in those rural areas? What kind of opportunities exist for the people whose land, this is their home, this is where they've grown up, this is where their ancestors have grown up, this is where they may look to their future, or else they go off to urban areas. These are the kind of questions that as ILC we're starting to facilitate a research initiative over the next few years with a number of our members to dig into these issues more. Because I think what's clear is there's a lot that we don't understand. And we realize as we dig into it, this is a cartoon from South Africa, from a newspaper in South Africa. Well, obviously land redistribution and land reform has been a big topic, but brings out, as we look at these questions, the key point that land distribution in a society, in a country, is really bound up in a lot of other distributions, and a lot of other distributions of decision-making power, of wealth in the economy, of attitudes, of the way people see or respect or fail to respect each other in a society. So without dealing with the land question, you're not going to deal with many of the other questions either. So in thinking of what we need to do, I'm going to run over, and I'm sorry it's going to be very superficial, but just because of time, run over drawing from what our members are saying, what the members of the International Land Coalition are focusing on in trying to address inequalities, 4 particular areas where our members are prioritizing we need to take action in addressing inequality and access to land. Now, the first one is probably a very self-evident one, but trying to deal with the concentration in land. And as we look at the work of our members, there are 4 particular areas where our members are trying to address issues of concentration. And the first one maybe is it's worldwide, but it's particularly prevalent in Africa, where a lot of land is publicly owned, formally publicly owned, even though in practice communities are living on that land and have lived on it for many generations and consider that land their own. In practice, it's publicly owned. And what we're seeing is a massive transfer of land from the public realm to the private realm. And it's very interesting, if you read the World Inequality Lab report from this year, or was it 2017, one of the trends that it points to in tracing the changes between 1980 and now is a huge shift in the proportion between public wealth in a country and private wealth in a country. That there's been a massive decrease of public wealth at the same time that there's been a massive increase of private wealth. And I think what we don't have data for it, but I would be absolutely sure that trend is reflected as well in land inequality, in land issues, because many countries, many governments are very rapidly handing over public land to private investors with the expectation that will fuel agricultural development. And in many countries where that's been happening, Ethiopia being one example, we've seen more recently, from what they started almost 10 years ago, a reversal of that, because there's a realization that actually it's not happening. The benefits are not accruing as they should. Many countries have been implementing, and this is not new, it's been happening for decades, but we're seeing a lot more interest in it recently, more controls on land ownership, particularly foreign land ownership. So some countries have absolute ceilings on land ownership. Hungary and Lithuania are 2 examples in Europe that have a ceiling, whether you're a citizen or not a citizen. You can't own more than 300 or 500 hectares of land. Many other countries have put ceilings on foreign ownership of land. So Mexico, Thailand, Uganda, Ethiopia, etc. Try and limit at least the foreign component of ownership. There are obviously many loopholes to that, and even from those countries that I mentioned, you probably are well aware of large land concentration which is taking place because people are able to get around the law. So which brings back the question of redistributive agrarian reform, because unless you're willing to deal with to sort of not only protect the transfer of public land or put ceilings on new ownership, you're willing to deal with existing ownership patterns and the extreme inequalities within that, then you're not going to make a dent on the issue. And we know how hard that is. We heard from the Indonesian minister this morning. His government, when it came in, promised 21.1 million hectares of redistribution of forest land and agrarian land. We're co-hosting a conference in Indonesia at the end of this year, together with the Indonesian government, to look at the progress on that. But it's not good. It's 3 years into their term. They have 1 year left before elections, as the minister said, and only a very small fraction of that land has actually been distributed. It's a big, big challenge. And then the last point really goes without saying, that redistribution land, even if you do it, is not enough, obviously. That farmers need to be empowered to use that land productively, to bring in an income. Otherwise, often those gains are reversed and farmers then lose the land. I'm really glad that we've heard a lot from Huairou Commission, which is also a member of ILC, and from IDLO on closing the gender gap. Because when we're talking about inequality in access to land, gender is the biggest inequality. And again, drawing from the work of our members on closing the gender gap in land, what many of our members would say is, yes, while, as Ilaria said, there's discrimination in the laws of many countries at the same time do accept gender equality. So, for example, if you look at the constitutions of African countries, 48 countries have gender equality guarantees in their national constitutions. That may not be reflected from the constitution to different legal provisions. It's certainly not reflected in many countries in terms of practice. So, for example, only 5 countries allow for co-ownership of land between a man and a woman in a household. So ways in which our members are engaging in trying to translate at least some semblance of commitment by African governments and by governments in other parts of the world for gender equality into reality has been, in drawing again an example from Africa, mobilizing across the continent with the African Union on first getting a commitment by the African Union, which came through 2 years ago, working for 30% of African land under women's ownership by 2025 or 2030. And getting commitments at that level, and getting those commitments then translated into action plans by national governments. The Women to Kilimanjaro is a very interesting campaign. You can follow that hashtag and find out what they're doing. And then a lot of the kind of work that Violet was explaining to us from her work in Kenya with Huairou Commission. In our website, we have a database of good practices in which women's access to land is one of the areas where we have the most good practices. And I've pulled out a few examples from Togo on paralegals, from Rwanda on making sure that women benefit from the tackling program of the government, from Nepal on joint land ownership certificates. The pictures from Ghana of women making videos, widowed women who'd lost their land making videos, and those videos becoming a testimony to their elected representatives for reversal of some of those abusive practices. So there's a lot of work by women's organizations from the ground up, which is bringing pressure on government processes and decision-making, complementing the pressure from, for example, in Africa, from the African Union coming down. Thirdly, I think what our members would emphasize often as well in thinking about rural economy is taking a territorial approach. So recognizing that much community land is claimed by communities, whether that's respected or formalized or not. Those are claims that exist because communities are using and have used for many generations that land. And so there's a lot of work, and Violet talked a little bit about it, of mapping those claims. And often where we see this being really effective is mapping those claims at a community level. And in fact, when you're talking, this is an example from Tanzania with pastoralist organizations. It's not, when you're looking at land use in dry lands, it's often not only mapping around village, but it's mapping a very extensive area of land that is used seasonally at different times of the year, and trying to then secure agreements about the use of that land and secure access to that land. Some research that one of our sister organizations did, the Rights and Resources Initiative, estimated that 65% of the surface of this earth is claimed in some way or another by local communities as land that is theirs by heritage, by right. And in fact, only 10% of land is recognized by their own governments as belonging to those communities. So there's a huge gap in the recognition of community land that we have the potential to close. Now, I'd like to close just looking at how do we get more data and greater inclusiveness in decision making over this. And it comes back to the point at the beginning that a lot of these issues are now being considered and being discussed with respect to inequality because organizations and some governments have put out that data. And this is my closing slide, an interesting example of that from our network is Scotland. Scotland is a country that only in 2000 dismantled feudalism. The Abolition of Feudal Tenure Act was legislated in 2000. Because you have a situation where less than 500 people own half the country. Now, the debate that led to that act, and then the Land Reform Act of 2013 in Scotland, was really a public debate, or an open debate, and it was a debate that was framed in terms of justice. To say, what kind of land distribution do we want in our country to build a more economic and socially just country, to build a fairer Scotland? And I think this is the kind of debate that we've been hearing from the speakers that have preceded me on how do we create space for this kind of democratic debate and democratic decision-making, citizen participation-making in questions of inequality in rural areas, and about the kind of future rural societies that we want to build. Thank you. I saw the... Yes.
Thanks, Mike. I'm afraid as land people, we've not been very good on our time management. So we are really short on time. We will take, Chitra is saying, 1 or 2 questions. So we don't have much time, but if you could introduce yourself and we take a few questions and then see how we go. I see one hand here. Oh yes, sorry. That's right. And we invite you to come up, join the meeting here so we can all see you. And please introduce yourself, join us here as part of the discussion, and fire away.
I'll be quick. My name is Ben Davis. I'm with FAO. I really liked what I heard. I agreed with everything you said. My question is, speaking from the perspective of FAO or from IFAD, is there anything that we can really, I have a feeling that what we do is really kind of scratching around the edges, right? And that the issue of land is one of the key structural constraints that really drives inequality. And if you look at the case of Latin America, look at the case of Colombia, that's what the Civil War was about. Hundreds of millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people dying, the same in Guatemala. And so when land is such a difficult structural constraint and when the interests are so strong, what can we really do as agencies? And so what is our space of action? And when we heard Barton talk this morning, okay, there's other equalities of opportunities such as health and education that are obviously very important as well. But I'm wondering, what can we really do with land that isn't just, we heard some good practices, but is there really substantial change happening with those good practices?
Thanks, Ben. Shall we take just one more before we get some comments, at least we'll take it from the mentee at least. In fact, there's been a few going through as I'm trying to look at them. I think, we've particularly heard on some of the challenges and solutions for strengthening women's access to land. 2 of the questions that have just gone past I thought would be interesting. One of them was, what is men's reaction to this? How do they respond to some of these measures to women's empowerment? There we go, it's in the middle now. Reacting to increased collective voice of women, are they concerned about a backlash? And then there was another question in terms of what are some of the obstacles to women's contribution? I saw a question, I'm not sure, there it is in the bottom right. So I thought we could take that as one question and take some comments from the speakers. Do we have time for one more?
Yes. Anyone would like to join the conversation?
Anybody else like to come up and even on these questions and if you have any comments?
Great.
Okay, thank you. And please introduce yourself. And then
Yes, my name is Maria Jose Moreno, and I am a Chief Gender Officer at the African Development Bank. And I would like to reflect with you in the issue of access to land and for women. And we have seen, we see in a number of countries that culture and religion is used, in particular in inheritance in the north of Africa, for example, to justify that women get less land and less inheritance in general than men. But in most development agencies don't get into the discussions of culture and religion to address social justice. I would like if you have some good examples or some guidance on that. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Maria. All right, maybe we can just, we didn't hear who these questions were directed at in particular, so any comments, and maybe we can start again with Ricardo, your thoughts on these questions?
Very briefly, I mean, I think you're right. Sometimes it feels like we're tinkering around the edges, and I mean, my sense is that the overall global dynamic is moving way faster than we as civil society or policymakers or international organizations are able to react. And then we start to see that the system is giving up. And I think we have the responsibility to collectively think how do we move ahead the curve? Because otherwise, like we're saying, people are angry everywhere. You see the results of the Latino barometer about the legitimacy of democratic institutions in Latin America. This is related to the fact that, over decades, we haven't been able, or governments have not been able to redress these issues of concentration. You know, before there were revolutions. Now it's an issue of we don't believe in institutions. So what do we do? I mean, that's a $1 million question, you know. But I think if we don't start tackling the issue at the international level, if we don't start putting together the resources that we have as international financial institutions, as global movements, as global organizations to address these local issues, then we'll be failing, and who knows what the consequences will be. So I think your question is very important because it addresses the urgency of what we're facing right now. The inequality crisis, the land crisis, this political system crisis around the world is something that you probably see once every 100 years, and I think we have to learn from previous experiences to kind of avoid anything dramatic from happening.
Thanks, Ricardo. Ilaria, you'd like to?
Yes, I think that the questions both on the screen and your question, you really touch the heart of the problem. We need to get to an understanding that helping women doesn't mean only. So helping women is not just a question of getting results for women. Helping women means getting a tangible result on the overall development spectrum. So once the international community and the local community understands and appreciates the value of helping women, not just as helping a sector of the population, but helping the whole development program or achieving broader development results, then we're going to be in a better place. We're not there yet, and the work the work needs to be done. As Michael was mentioning, we do have the international frameworks. We have the CEDAW Convention. We have a number of other international legal frameworks protecting women quite well, but a lot of work needs to be done at the local level. So global level, local level, they have to be integrated. The issue of women needs to be tackled at the local level, because you're talking about culture, you're talking about religion. There is no one-size-fits-all. These are all very specific problems that need the understanding, the local understanding and participation of all constituencies. It is extremely important that men participate in the effort and struggle to empower women, because women cannot be self-empowered. The whole community needs to be involved in empowering women, rural women or otherwise. I give you a very brief example. I am based in the Netherlands, in The Hague, with IDLO. And for just after International Women's Day, we organized an event talking about the participation of women in the justice sector. And as usual, we had only women present. We had a room of like 50, 80 people, 100% women. And I was not happy. I was terribly unhappy because I said, this is not a result for me. I would like to see men participating in the debates that involve women's empowerment, because women's empowerment is not just empowering women, it's working for the broader community, it's working for men and women and children and everyone else. So as long as we see only women involved in the women's struggle, we're not going to get there. And that's a question linked to culture and religion and shift of mindset in order to involve the whole community in women's struggles.
Thanks, Ilaria. Before I give to Mike, Violet, I don't know if Violet is on the line, whether we give her a chance. Mino is also here from the Huairou Commission. Any thoughts? Would you like to comment on the questions that were raised? You can come and sit here. Come and sit here. And
yes, maybe just to highlight that it is really important if we want to, let's say, move on the agenda that we have to really support not only grassroots women but also local communities in protecting their rights. That would be the point, and really investing in this organizing that Violet highlighted, because it takes time to build local communities agencies, and as Huairou Commission we are really supporting this organizing process, and every time it's like it's not that much recognized because it's not tangible, the results are not tangible, and it takes time to get, for example, women to be organized and to be recognized. And sometimes when we started from, let's say, scratch, as you said, it's not really the investment that we put in are not really appreciated, because people think that this process of organizing is not important. And I think every time we are going somewhere, that's what we wanted to emphasize, that invested in this is one point that we really need to improve. Maybe that's a point that I wanted to highlight that wasn't said.
Okay. Thanks, Mino. We really are out of time. I'm going to give Mike a minute to comment, and then we will wrap up.
Okay, I wanted to comment on the question of how do we hope to bring about change, which is so fundamentally addressing the structures and interests of power in a society. And I mean, the obvious one is investing in the organizations of women, of men, of local communities, of indigenous peoples, of farmers, to be able to influence political decision making in their own countries. But I want to dwell on I think one of the key opportunities that we have, and that's data. The SDGs put a lot of emphasis on data, and it was powerful this morning hearing the SDGs have put out the aspiration of leave no one behind. When you look at the data, What does it tell us? We've left people behind. We've followed a development path which has left people behind. And so putting out the data that can then feed debates within countries of, okay, does that mean we're okay with leaving people behind? In other words, we continue with this development path? Or are we going to let the data allow us to challenge the direction we're taking and take a different route? In Scotland, coming back to Scotland, it was civil society organizations putting out the data that 432 people own half the country. And in fact, many of those 432 people don't even live in Scotland, they live outside of Scotland. And getting that information into the public realm then provoked a debate that led to a number of land reform acts. So data, I think, can feed at least debate. Now, we know in many countries there isn't the democratic process to allow that debate to automatically feed into decision making. But if it can feed debate and feed action, feed social action, that will eventually bring around that change, hopefully we have some chance.
Thanks, Mike. I think we really need to draw to a close. So thanks to everybody. Obviously the topic is complex and vast, and I hope we've been able to convey the message that access to land is really fundamental to our discussions in terms of inequality and what to do about it. So I'd like to thank all the panelists and the others who have joined them. Thank you very much.